And joining us now on the line in Spokane, Washington, Lawrence Pintak. He is Dean at the Edward R. Murrow College of Communication at Washington State University. Dean Pintak, it's good to have you on the line. How are you tonight?
I'm doing just fine, Steve. Thank you.
Glad to hear it. We, of course, talk about the CNN moment of many years ago when, during the first Gulf War, it was kind of the coming out party for that network. And now people are talking about the Al Jazeera moment. Tell us whether you believe the significance of Al Jazeera's coverage as it relates to what's happening in Egypt right now is, in fact, the coming out moment for this network.
Well, it really is in many ways, and in some ways it's even more so for Al Jazeera English. And as you know, those are kind of sister organizations. But Jazeera in general has played a critical role in this uprising. Social media, we can talk more about later, but certainly social media was a factor in organizing the activists. But the fact that people are out on the streets in the numbers we're looking at really is TV coming to the fore.
Yeah, go further on that if you would. We will talk about social media, but how has the coverage by Al Jazeera prompted, the tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people to go into the streets?
Well, it's not just Jazeera, but certainly Jazeera is at the forefront and it's gotten the ink. Fast forward, or rewind, I should say, back 15 years ago. There was no Arabic language satellite television in the Arab world except for the Egyptian state TV. And so people in the Arab world were locked into watching government television. Television journalism was an oxymoron. All you could see was governments. 20 years ago, 1990, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, most Saudis did not know about the invasion for 3 days because the Saudi media sat on the story at the orders of the government. Now that's inconceivable. So now you have people turning on their television set, first of all, seeing the Tunisian uprising and saying, hey, we can do that too. And then across the Arab world, people are watching this. So even when the government cut off internet and cell phone in Egypt, Egyptians could still watch what was going on.
Well, let me follow up on that, because I guess one thing I'm not completely clear on is that Al Jazeera's Cairo bureau was set on fire, and the bureau was closed even before that. So how have they been able to do their job, given those two things?
Well, they're playing fast and loose. They're working all the angles. At one point, the government knocked their signal off the government-owned satellite, or government-controlled satellite. So their engineers quickly did an end run and got back on the satellite through someone else. Then the government came in and they shut down the bureau. They arrested some of their people, but they dispersed. They went all over Cairo and they were operating from all different directions. And most interestingly, now we have, as I said, in '96, Jazeera's launched. It's the only Arabic language satellite channel. Today we have more than 500. And over the weekend, when the government knocked Jazeera pretty effectively off the satellites, 10 of those other stations said, hey, we will rebroadcast your signal. So the signal was still available to Egyptians, and like many other reporters, the Jazeera reporters went off in all different directions and still managed to do uplinks, still managed to do phone reports, still managed to get their tape out.
Let's consider some of the quality of their coverage now. We get that they're on the air and influential, but let me follow up on this. According to the CIA World Factbook, nearly 60% of Egypt's 80 million people live outside of urban areas. And I want to know whether or not we have heard on Al Jazeera those non-urban voices commenting on the protests.
Well, I think you've seen some of it. Certainly the protests, the urban centers have been the dominant coverage. But not just Cairo, certainly Alexandria, Luxor, Aswan, Sinai. So we've seen it from other parts of the country. Have they had people out in the middle of nowhere talking to people? Not that much, no.
Okay, many of the protesters are young and educated, but the overall literacy rate in Egypt, I'm given to understand, is less than 75%, and not all of the country's large young population goes to college. So is Al Jazeera giving voice to the less educated among the population as well?
Well, certainly in this uprising, it is the educated young whose voices have come to the fore. And again, you go back to the social media aspect. It was the activists that organized this, and those are largely college graduates, well-educated, who can't get a job and are frustrated. Now, what we're seeing now on the streets is many, many, many more people, because again, watching satellite television, whether it's Jazeera or Arabia or some of the Egypt-based satellite channels like On TV, people have been inspired, and those who are not college educated, those who are not very literate, are out on the streets now.
I don't mean to dismiss the significance of seeing pictures of violence in the streets. That's obviously hugely important to the story. But it's also important, obviously, to get a complete and even, hard to do on television, but let's say a nuanced picture of what's going on there as well. How effectively do you think Al Jazeera has done at that?
Well, I think they've done a lot better than most others. I can put on my TV reporter's hat, my old CBS correspondent's hat, and say that we in TV are not very good at subtlety. The 15-minute interviews are relatively few and far between. So we fall back on black hats and white hats, good guys and bad guys. Hence we hear on North American television a lot about the Muslim Brotherhood. But certainly the fact that Jazeera and some of the other satellite channels have done wall-to-wall coverage means that they are getting a lot of these subtleties in.
Al Jazeera English, I guess we should just take a step back right now and focus a little less on what's been happening in the streets of Egypt and more broadly on the kind of service that they're providing. Al Jazeera English became available to Canadians about a year ago, and I want to know how Al Jazeera in Arabic is different from what we are, I guess, accustomed to watching on mainstream all-news channels like CNN or our all news channels here in Canada.
Well, Jazeera Arabic and Jazeera English are two very different organizations. They answer to the same boss. They share a lot of videotape, and certainly the coverage we've seen out of Cairo is enhanced on both sides by the fact that they have so many cameras on the streets. But they really do have a very different voice. Jazeera Arabic is proudly Arab. They proudly say that they represent an Arab viewpoint through an Arab prism to an Arab audience. That's not what you hear on Jazeera English, and it's not the case on Jazeera English. It is a polyglot news organization. I would argue the first truly borderless journalism that we're seeing. As I think you know, the former managing director was a former head of CBC News. The current managing director is a Brit who's worked for both British and North American channels. And their on-air people there's Arabs, there's Malaysians, there's Australians, you name it. So they come at it from a very broad international viewpoint. I mean, the ads say that it's a global South viewpoint, but it really is an international viewpoint. Whereas Jazeera Arabic certainly there's a lot more hyperbole, there's a lot more excitement, sensationalism, more wearing the Arabness on the sleeve, and certainly in this kind of a story, driving the idea of change and being excited about the idea of political change.
So when you say it's a proudly Arabic channel, do I infer from that then that when they cover, for example, the Palestinian-Israeli question, they are not even pretending to try to be sort of up the middle on that? It is a story told from the Palestinian perspective?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, you go back to the Iraq War, for example, where North American news organizations were reporting it embedded with the Marines, for example, in the siege of Fallujah, outside Fallujah. Jazeera and Arabiya and other Arab channels were inside Fallujah, reporting it through the prism of the Arabs in Fallujah. Now, you can argue, we can do an hour-long program on were they biased, were they focusing too much on the dead babies and the wounded civilians, at the expense of the fact that there were guys running around with guns. But the bottom line is, it is a different perspective, and they are proudly Arab. Now, on Palestine is interesting, because Jazeera is not without its critics in the region. And people, just as down here in the U.S., people line up behind Fox or MSNBC, depending on their politics. Same thing happens in the Arab world. So there are people who line up behind Jazeera, and they think Jazeera is the greatest thing since sliced bread, and others think it's evil incarnate. On Palestine, they're perceived as being pro-Hamas and anti-Palestine authority.
Now, just as English is spoken with a Canadian accent, with a British accent, an Australian accent, a Southern United States accent, a Midwest accent, I can go on, a New England accent, Arabic is not the same across the entire Arab world either. How does Al Jazeera attempt to kind of speak with a unified voice amongst all those different Arabic dialects?
Well, in the Arab world, you've got a couple of things going on, not that we don't have in English. Classical Arabic is not something people speak. It's what you read in the Quran. Then there's what we generally call newspaper Arabic, which is a written form of Arabic that everyone understands. But, if I sit with a Moroccan and a Yemeni, quite frequently they are unable to converse in Arabic. They're speaking either in French or English or through, for example, an Egyptian, because everybody in the Arab world understands Egyptian colloquial Arabic because of the movie industry. Egypt was the Bollywood of the Middle East. Now what's happening is, because satellite TV, not just the news channels, but across the board, is so dominated by Lebanese and Palestinians and Jordanians and Syrians, that generally everyone understands that form of Arabic. So there's an evolution of the language going on, and there's, God knows, there's academics who've written whole treatises on the evolution of Arabic because of satellite TV.
Let me try a few kind of overtly political questions here. Is Al Jazeera pro-Hamas and pro-Hezbollah?
Well, there are many who would argue so, yes. And certainly they did a WikiLeaks-style dump called the Palestine Papers a couple of weeks ago of the documents from the secret negotiations between the Israelis and Palestinians. And that emphatically embarrassed the Palestine Authority.
Well, I've got actually a little excerpt from that. Let me read this. The documents were leaked to Al Jazeera detailing the negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And here's one little leak here. Israel keeping the Jewish neighborhoods it has built around Jerusalem. Palestinians settling for cash payments as a, quote, symbolic right of refugees to return to homes their families were driven from in 1948. You know, these kinds of leaks, what do they say about the way Al Jazeera is covering the story?
Well, yeah, I think you could say the same, ask the same question about the WikiLeaks documents and how Western media reported it. On one level, you can say that, hey, they're reporting the facts. They got a hold of these documents, and if OTV had gotten a hold of these documents, or TVO, excuse me, had gotten a hold of these documents, you may well have run them too. So, you know, there's this fine line whenever journalists get a hold of secret documents. I think most people would make a distinction between the kind of reporting they've done on the Palestine Papers, or most Western news organizations have done on the other WikiLeaks documents, and dumping secret names, informants, and putting people in danger.
But I guess, you know, we're trying to figure out here whether, you know, I guess again, we could spend another hour figuring out whether ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, all of these purported to be straight up the middle networks actually do report things straight up the middle, or whether they're trying to be players. And I think the allegation against Al Jazeera, certainly Arabic, has been they're not of that tradition. They actually are different. What would you say, having looked at it?
Well, no, I think they're players, and I think if any news organization had that kind of thing dumping in their laps, they would have gone with it. Witness the fact that the Western, you just quoted from a Western news organization, Western media has all reported that stuff, and you can rewind back to the whole Osama bin Laden tapes issue. There's a strong argument to be made that bin Laden would not have achieved the level of awareness or the level of influence he did had not Al Jazeera existed. But by the same token, most Western news organizations, until the White House kind of put the kibosh on it, were also running the bin Laden tape. So it was Jazeera benefited from it, but most news organizations, when they get that kind of thing, do go with it.
Okay, Lawrence, let's finish up in our last minute on this. Al Jazeera, many people may not know, is funded by the autocratic state of Qatar. And I'm wondering what role that country has on Al Jazeera's coverage.
Well, you don't see a lot of reporting on domestic Qatari politics on Jazeera, do you? That said, there's an argument to be made, who cares, right? The bottom line is, and I've spent lots of time in the Jazeera newsroom sitting on meetings where they're making story decisions, and for the most part, the Qatari ownership is not having a direct role. Where it becomes an issue is on issues that affect Qatari foreign policy. So we've seen Jazeera's coverage change depending on the vagaries of Middle East politics. The classic example of that is Jazeera has always been very tough on the Saudis because, of course, the Emir of Qatar created Jazeera to give himself juice as a balance against the Qataris. So they've always been very critical of the Saudis. But a year or two ago, when suddenly Iran comes to the fore in the wake of the Iraq War, and you have this Cold War between Iran and the Shia against the Sunni Arab states, well, Qatar and Saudi had a rapprochement, and almost immediately it was kid's glove on coverage of Saudi Arabia on Jazeera.
Lawrence Pintak, always did enjoy your reporting on CBS Evening News, and I'm glad to have had this opportunity to talk to you on TVO tonight. Thanks so much for joining us on the line from Spokane, Washington.
My pleasure.